Hello, and welcome to Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies, Course P107. We're calling this Introduction to Composition and Research. The catalog actually describes it as Introduction to Research and Library Methods, Research Skills, and Composition. But we'll call it Composition and Research because that's the order in which we will approach these subjects. My name is Dave Rogers. I'll be your instructor. You should have either in print or as a PDF document a copy of the syllabus to the course. That's where I want to begin for this class. This class is structured as either a 14 or 15-week course. Class sessions will run approximately 2 hours with a break at the halfway point of about 15 minutes. That'll give you time to get up, stretch your legs, and take a little break, catch your breath. As we go through the syllabus, pay attention to the requirements for the class. If you are taking this class, you're probably taking it for credit, and that means you need to do the work in order to get the grade. This course is meant to introduce you to three basic things. The basic principles of writing. Writing is not simply being able to take a pen, put it to paper, and form the characters A, B, C through Z. Writing is meant to communicate information clearly, accurately, and understandably. That's what the first part of this course is about. The second point or part of this course, the second object, is to teach you proper documentation of both the sources that you use in your writing and proper documentation of your resources, the things that are used as the basis of the material that you will write. These are objects, books, articles, magazines, computer databases, things of that sort, your Bible, other pieces of information that are commonly found in academic, public, theological, church libraries, and perhaps in your own home. But to document these sources and resources as you formulate your thoughts and put them to paper, you also need to be aware of the proper format for documenting them. It's not enough to quote from Flavius Josephus at the end of the 1st century AD and scribble in the margin or just put in parenthesis Josephus. Some folks will understand exactly who you're talking about. But in an academic context, you need to document what version, what source, where you found this information. And there are proper formats used in academia and used in the literary world to accomplish exactly that. The object of the exercise in documenting your sources and your resources is to enable whoever reads what you write to be able to come back and say, okay, I can go back to where this writer found this information and either verify that it actually says what he claims or learn more about that source or that resource. The third part of this class, it is meant to acquaint you with the basic procedures and resources that are common to research in libraries. At one point during our course this semester, we'll go next door to the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies library, which is adjacent to the room where I am tonight. And you'll get a quick look at that. And then we'll go upstairs in this same building to the Piedmont Road Church of Christ's library, which is at the other end of the building. They have an excellent church library. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between the resources that you will typically find in a public library or even in a high school or university library, and the kinds of resources that you might expect to find in a church library or a theological library. Now, we'll cover fundamental techniques of writing and composition. If you have some college background, you may be thinking to yourself, this sounds suspiciously like English 1301. It is. We're going to put emphasis on three aspects of your writing skills: clear, accurate formation of your thoughts, clear, accurate expression of your thoughts and the information that you have acquired, and clear, accurate presentation of that information. Now, in the syllabus, you'll find my email address and contact information, and feel free to contact me if you have questions. There is a required textbook for this class, and it is not a brand new book, so it is not terribly expensive. You can get it used on Amazon or perhaps at Google Books if you want to go there, somewhere like that. It is usually a paperback. It's a college textbook by a gentleman named Joseph M. Williams. This is mine, and mine is the 6th edition. I believe it is now available in the 10th edition. This is 2024. It may be in an edition beyond that. This book is called Style: 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace. And Williams is an excellent illustrator of the lessons that you need to learn. Now, I said there are three basic areas. As you look at the course objectives and the assessment of student learning outcomes in the syllabus, you'll find the statement, this course is designed to accomplish 2 fundamental purposes. Well, those 3 things fall under these 2 purposes. Purpose number 1 is to introduce you to the importance of accurate written communication. Well, you know what I meant is no excuse for muddy writing. Grammar matters, and I'll show you that before we're done. You need to understand sentence structure. If you are 45 years old or older, you may remember fondly, or you may remember with some pain, depending on your perspective. You should remember pretty much everything that we're going to cover in the first 6 weeks of this class from high school, or at least from your freshman year in college. If you're under about 45 years old, you may even have a college degree in English and discover that you've never talked about or studied some of these very fundamental aspects of writing. What is a sentence? A sentence has a subject and a predicate. A sentence has a noun and a verb. A sentence conveys a complete thought. There are some fundamental techniques of thought formation and writing that will help you, that will make it easier for you to express and complete your thoughts so that others understand what's in your mind. The purpose of communication, whether it's in print, written by your own hand, or spoken, or demonstrated in some way, illustrated in some way. The purpose of communication is to recreate in the mind of the receiver, that would be the hearer or the reader, the same image or the same information or the same understanding the same idea, in other words, that exists in the mind of the source of that information, be it you as the writer, or you as the speaker, or you as the illustrator. Remember this: an illustration, when it works, is like a light bulb. It helps you see things clearly. There are an encyclopedia, if you will, of common errors in both speech and writing that most of 21st century English-speaking society, not just American, but all English-speaking, and I suppose in other languages as well, but English is the language we're dealing with. There's an encyclopedia filled with errors, metaphorically speaking, that most people don't even recognize. But they hinder clear expression. And when you learn a little bit about them and learn to avoid them, you can express yourself much more clearly, much more accurately, and much more simply. Don't underestimate the virtue of simplicity in speech and in writing. Now, I mentioned a while ago being familiar with various standards of documentation. At the collegiate level, there are 4 main documentation standards that are either accepted or required in various colleges and universities and seminaries, and likewise here in the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. In a nutshell, I'll just name them and we'll come back and talk about them in a later class. But in a nutshell, they are Turabian, named for Kate L. Turabian, the writer or the author, if you will, of what is commonly described as the Chicago Manual of Style. So CMS or Turabian. There is the Modern Language Association, MLA, standard of documentation. There is the American Psychiatric Association, or APA, standard of documentation. And then there is the SBL, standard of documentation, which, if you are pursuing education in theology and Bible in some ministry-related field, you may find yourself attending a school that requires that you document in the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature format. These 4 basic styles or standards of documentation impact the details of information that you provide about sources and resources, the order in which that information is provided, and the format and manner of presentation, not just of your source information, but of your presentation itself. There's a lot of overlap. There are a number of significant differences. If you use Microsoft Word, bless you, I do not find that a comfortable word processor to use. But if you use Microsoft Word like much of the world does, there is a setting where you can tell it which citation methodology, Chicago Manual of Style, MLA, APA, I don't know if it supports a Society of Biblical Literature or not, SBL, but you can set that so that when you enter in resources into its database, it will automatically document them in the proper format. There are also online resources, and I will point you towards some of those, that you can use to check or double check that you have the required information in the proper order, in the proper format, so that you can correctly document your information. So, object number 1, according to the syllabus, introduce you to the importance of clear, accurate written communication in all of these things. The first 6 weeks or so, 7 weeks of this class will focus not so much on research as on composition. If this is all familiar to you, if this is painfully familiar to you, Please be patient and bear with it because we will get to the research aspect of this. Object number 2 is that second aspect, to become familiar with library resources, organization, and especially church and theological libraries. Your understanding of this course material will be assessed by weekly summaries of the required readings. You need to read the chapters in William's book and then either answer questions if he poses them or summarize. And by summary, I mean a 1 to 2 page summary of the material that you have read in outline form. Just demonstrate that you understand, you grasp the basic points of what you've read, and that will be turned in for a grade. There may be weekly quizzes or semi-weekly quizzes over some of this material. So beware of that. Be forearmed because you've been forewarned. There is a midterm exam, which comes basically at the midpoint in the course, and there will be a final exam that will be cumulative. It will cover everything from day 1 to day last. This class for credit also requires that you submit a research paper, a term paper, and that will require at least 10 to 15 pages on a specified topic. We'll talk about those topics later. The object of the exercise for you as the student is that when you finish this class, you should be able to demonstrate that you know how to clearly and accurately express your thoughts, express your ideas on paper or on the computer. You should be able to show that you know how to locate and assess, that is, determine if this information that you've located is usable or useful or helpful, or if it's utterly unrelated. You should be able to demonstrate that you know how to organize your information so that you can marshal it into presentation for a formal research paper or some other written assignment of a collegiate level. You should be able to demonstrate that you understand how to assimilate, how to take and put together and draw conclusions from the information that you have found on whatever subject you are writing. And you should also, by the end of this course, be able to demonstrate that you have at least a working grasp, a working knowledge. You don't need to know all the ins and outs and details. You don't need to memorize the Chicago Manual of Style or the Modern Language Association protocols for documentation, but you should be comfortable enough with them that you can look up and properly document your information sources so that you can present them in a formal way as a research paper. I mentioned the required text. Joseph Williams, Joseph Bishop is the co-writer with this particular edition, subsequent editions. You should be able to find this online, paperback, anywhere from $7 to $15. Depends on how new it is. The page numbers will be a little bit different from edition to edition. The paragraphing, a word change here or there, the basic information should be the same, at least from edition 6 forward. Edition 6 is dated, is copyrighted (2000). So this is not a brand new book. It is excellent, however, well worth having. There are also some suggested texts that I want to just make you aware of. If you've never heard of William Strunk and Ellen White, E.B. White, this is Strunk and White. This book is called The Elements of Style. And it has to do with writing clearly, writing accurately. It is also a very thin little book. It's not hard reading at all. It's actually, if you enjoy reading for information, it's quite entertaining. It's less than 100 pages. It's available in hardback or paperback, published by Pearson, and it's well worth having to improve your writing skills. Going back much farther comparatively is Robert Gunning's The Technique of Clear Writing. Now, this has been a college textbook for many decades now, and it is quite a stout book, but it is a superb reference in how to write clearly. Two others that I want to draw to your attention. If you are contemplating a collegiate career, if you're contemplating going on from GSOP to Freed-Hardeman or Faulkner University, or even a state university to pursue some sort of a degree, or going back, especially if you plan to major in Bible or ministry or something of that sort, there is a book out now by Nancy Jean Weimeister. Now, Mrs. Weimeister is not a sister in Christ. She's if memory serves me, I believe she's a Sabbatarian, a Seventh-day Adventist, I think. But this book, which you can find online for about $15, is called Your Guide to Writing Quality Research Papers for Students of Religion and Theology. So it's a fairly narrow focus book, but there is some very useful, valuable information here. One other booklet, really, it's not a book. It's about 50 pages, 68 pages, I believe, that you need to read if you're going to write. And this is called Avoiding Plagiarism. Plagiarism is a word that in the 21st century, even many college graduates have heard, but probably could not define. And the fact that it has been very, very much in the news as of January 2024 because of Claudine Gay and Harvard University only highlights how poorly the higher education community has enforced its standards. Plagiarism is taking for your own the work of someone else, claiming it as yours without giving credit where you got it. There's another way to describe plagiarism, and that's the word theft. Plagiarism is theft, plain and simple. And plagiarism has no place in formal writing. Plagiarism has no place in higher education. Plagiarism has no place in biblical or theological education. And plagiarism has no place and is not tolerated in the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. If you plagiarize, you will be found out, and your grade will reflect that. All right. One further word of explanation about the grade for this course. There are 4 criteria for this course for the grade. The weekly assignments, the quizzes, whatever, memory work, things of that sort, the cumulative scores of those outlines and things that you hand in on a weekly basis. Those all gathered together, the average of that will count 25% of your final grade. The midterm exam will count 25%. That makes 50. The final exam will count 25%. That makes 75. And the term paper counts 25%. That makes 100% of your final grade. So That's the substance of the syllabus. If you look at the syllabus on page 4, you find the schedule for the winter/spring semester of 2024 here at Piedmont Road. Tonight is January the 11th, and so the course material for this night's class is to introduce the course, to introduce the teacher, to overview the syllabus and the course requirements for credit, and then to talk about things such as the value of English for a preacher, the importance of using proper grammar, some common errors in writing, and to introduce the ideas of composition, documentation, and research. You have 2 assignments tonight, due next week if possible. Number 1, order a copy of the textbook. With overnight delivery, you don't have to pay extra for overnight delivery if you're an Amazon Prime member, but even if you're not a Prime member, don't pay extra for overnight delivery. You can skate through another week without the book. Just get it the cheapest way you can and get to work on it. Order a copy of the required textbook. Style, 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace. And you have a writing assignment. This should be a 1-page essay. Only 1 page. That's about 500 words for an average writer. Whether you handwrite it or preferably type it and print it, please, or email it. The theme, why I want to preach. Now, if you don't plan to preach, you might alter that slightly. Why I want to catch kangaroos in Australia, or whatever it is. But make it germane to what you're doing. This class, as I said, is scheduled out as a 14 or 15-week semester. It can go either way. And so you'll find that schedule, I think it's 14 weeks in the syllabus. We may add an extra week and we'll adjust the dates accordingly if need be. So, let's begin. This is a course about writing. Research involves writing. If you don't like to write, if you find it burdensome and just, oh, it's an onerous chore to write, you're probably not going to enjoy this class. This is not a class about rules. I before E except after C or when sounded as A in neighbor and way. It's very helpful to be able to spell accurately. And if you have a computer, a word processor, even an iPad, just composing on the notepad on an iPad, there's really no excuse for rampant, consistent misspellings because everything, even your phone, will check your spelling. And if you don't have that, you can go online and check your spelling. So it's not about rules per se. This is a course about writing and principles. However, there are some rules, and we need to know those and observe them. The sections in this class on documentation are about rules. When we talk about the Modern Language Association's protocols for documentation, or the American Psychiatric Association, and why the psychiatrists have to have their own standard of documentation, let me be frank, I think that speaks to ego more than necessity. But regardless of the motivation, there are rules on documentation so that you don't have to memorize them, but you do need to know where to check them and make sure you're following them. on that 1 to 2 page paper why I want to preach. If you don't intend to preach, maybe your theme could simply be why I don't want to preach. But write the paper. Correctly spoken and correctly written English enhance a preacher's ability to communicate the gospel of salvation effectively and efficiently. Poor grammar, whether it's in our speech or in our writing, poor grammar will distract your audience, your hearers, your listeners, your readers from your message. Whether it's poor grammar because of poor sentence structure that muddies the thought, the idea, the image you're trying to create in the reader's mind, or poor grammar simply by use of poor punctuation that leaves the reader uncertain if you're making a point or asking a question. Poor grammar distracts, it detracts, it takes away from your message. In the same way, when you speak, mispronounced, misused, misapplied words distract from the impact of the message. Let me give you an example. Since this is January of 2024 at the moment, you will hear a lot in the coming months about the upcoming election, and you will hear about the conflicts going on in the world around us, and this candidate or that conflict will ebb or flow in the polls or in their conflict. And you will hear journalists and talking heads on television say that this event or this poll, this candidate has just been decimated in this poll. And they use that word, decimated. Decimated. D-E-C-I-M-A-T-E-D. Decimated. That word, decimated, does not mean what they're using it to express. What they are trying to convey by the word decimated is the idea of devastation. Devastation, tremendous damage. Decimation, if you had to study Latin in high school years ago, you'll know this. Deci, 10, like decades, and decibels. Mated, from mata, dead. 10 dead. To decimate someone means to kill 1 out of every 10 in their army. To decimate something means to destroy 10% of it. That leaves 90% intact. Decimation may be a devastating experience, but what the commentators on TV are trying to express is not 10% loss, but tremendous devastation. Words need to be used correctly in their context. Where's my eraser? So, when we talk about using words accurately, we're not just talking about sentence structure, we're also talking about even things as simple as word choice. In the 21st century, the preacher or the Bible class teacher who chooses to use the King James Version of 1611, which your King James Version is not the 1611 version, it's the 1769 edition, over 150 years later. If you use the King James or the American Standard Version as your main biblical text, you would be wise to become familiar with the proper pronunciation of archaic and obsolete words that you find in those translations. For instance, you'll find in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 17, the word D-R-A-U-G-H-T. That's not draught. That word is pronounced draft. D-R-A-F-T. That's a draft. Let down the nets for a draft, not a draught. The ability to correctly identify the various words in your Bible not only contributes to your own understanding of the verse that you're reading, it also enables you to effectively defend the points of doctrine that might be found within that particular verse. Learning to diagram sentences is particularly helpful in that process. And time permitting, we'll spend a little bit of time one night on the basic principles. We'll use some Bible verses to make the point, but we'll spend a little bit of time one night diagramming a couple of Bible verses to illustrate this very point. Accuracy in expression is the key to understanding on the part of the reader or the hearer. The Apostle Paul made that point regarding the mystery of Christ in Ephesians chapter 3, in verses 1 through 4. Take your Bible and just turn to Ephesians chapter 3, and let's take a moment and read those verses together. I discovered that I neglected to get my Bible out when I got all the other books out. In Ephesians chapter 3, in verses 1 through 4, the English Standard Version, which is on balance an excellent modern speech translation. I'm not wed to any one translation, but compare them. Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, the Apostle Paul writes, "For this reason." What reason is he talking about? Well, you have to go back into chapter 2 to find the reason. "For this reason, I, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, on behalf of you Gentiles, assuming that you have heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for you, how the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I have written briefly. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ." Verse 4 in Ephesians chapter 3 is, as the expression goes, the money quote. The Apostle Paul is saying to these Ephesian Christians, when you read what I have written to you and you understand it accurately, then if I have expressed it accurately, and it was because it was inspired by the Holy Spirit, then the image, the information, the understanding that's created in the reader's minds should be what? You can perceive my insight. It should be exactly the same as Paul's. That's accurate communication in the written word. Use of proper grammar simplifies the writer's style and clarifies the message. Now, at the beginning of each class after tonight, we'll do some oral drills. Now, if we were in class together in person, we'd do these audibly together, back and forth. In this recorded format, I'll read them and trust you to follow along with me. But their purpose is to reinforce the student's understanding of the basic aspects of proper English usage. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of different vocabularies. General language, a general vocabulary, uses words that have no special use label. The words just mean what they mean. Their understanding, their meaning is generally obvious and understood to everybody who uses and hears them, and the same within a fairly narrow range for everyone who uses and hears them. Slang words, jargon words are not part of the general language. General language is sometimes described or characterized in the academic world as formal language. But it actually includes both formal and informal kinds of words, and it's acceptable in nearly every setting. It's what we might describe as pulpit language. Informal language, this is number 2. An informal vocabulary is made up of words that are not normally applied, unless perhaps for emphasis sake, in a formal context. A preacher would not normally use the word ain't in the pulpit. That ain't gonna fly here. But he might do that for emphasis sake, a humorous thing of sorts. The difference between formal and informal, or general and informal, is the difference between saying gym, G-Y-M, and gymnasium. This is what we might describe as casual or conversational vocabulary. There is also something called standard language vocabulary, and that's the everyday vocabulary that most people use. And it straddles the line between general and informal vocabularies. It's professional workplace speech. We speak one way casually to the coworker next to us. We speak another way more formally to the boss who supervises us. We might say, yeah, sure, to the guy next to us. Yes, sir, to the boss instructing us or directing us. And then there is what sometimes is described as non-standard language, a fourth vocabulary, non-standard language. And that consists of archaic words, obsolete words. If you read from the King James Version, words like thee and thou, vowel forms like thinkest and doeth, as well as slang terms. The man who stands on the pitcher's mound on a baseball diamond and throws the ball with his left hand is very properly described in baseball jargon as a southpaw hurler. A hurler because he's the pitcher. A southpaw because he's throwing with his left hand. Illiterate constructions, that word ain't, fall into this category as well. And this could very well be described by some folks as hurts to hear it speech. This is a manner of speaking, and it would certainly be a manner of writing that would be painful to read. Now, I want to give you a number of just a quick assortment of common errors in writing, common mistakes that people make in writing. And the first of these sounds like a mathematical problem. And students will sometimes say, what does that have to do with writing? You're talking about numbers. Yes, I am talking about numbers. And this is called subject-verb disagreement in number. Subject, verb, disagreement. In number. What is number in this case? You have two kinds of number in grammar. You have singular I, me, he, she, you, and you have plural. We, they, and if you're from the South, informally, we'd say y'all. If you're from Pennsylvania, you might say yins, which is short for ye ones. And if you're from some other parts of the north, you'd say all y'all, parts of the not quite north. Number applies not just to the subject, but also to the verb. How so? The verb to be. To be. You would say in the singular, I what? I am. You are. He or she or it is. Singular subject, singular verb. One person in the subject, one object in the subject, a verb that speaks to one object. In the plural, you would say, we are. They are. Something you might notice here is that are can be either singular or plural in English. Context matters. Context for whether are is singular or plural is determined by the subject. You, which can also be plural. Let's add that. You are. It's determined by context. So, you would not say then, she are. Because that's normally a plural verb, Singular noun. You would not say, we am, because that's a plural noun, a collective, that's us, we, and that's a singular verb. Am. It is amazing to me how common these errors of number disagreement between subject and verb have become in common professional writing in the 21st century. I'm not going to illustrate each of these from this point forward as we go forward, and we'll take a break in just a moment. But I want you to see that every one of these common errors is easy to recognize when you write it out. The second of these, first is subject and verb disagreement in number. Then there's the error of common noun and verb disagreement in number. Tense and time disagreement. Capitalization errors. When do you capitalize a word? Well, we know that proper nouns, names, for example, are supposed to be capitalized. But not every word that can be needs to be. It is distressing to those of us who pay attention to grammar to notice just how often younger writers particularly will substitute numerals 8 for words, ATE. This is not the same as this, even if it sounds the same. And you don't substitute numerals in writing in place of spelling out their own words. In writing, formal writing, you would not put the numeral in a sentence. You would substitute the properly spelled word, E-I-G-H-T. So, substituting numerals for words is an error in writing. Now, there are exceptions to that. Dates, 1492, the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In writing in a paragraph, in writing prose, you need not spell out 1492. You would write 1492 in those numerals. In citing biblical chapters and verses, for example, Mark chapter 16, verse 16, it would be perfectly acceptable and basically correct to write Mark and then 1:6 with a colon and 1:6, not SIXTEN in its place. What's an apostrophe for? What is the purpose of an apostrophe? Apostrophes have to do with possession, not plurality. What about contractions? Can't versus cannot. What about plurals and collectives? We'll talk about those. Noun and pronoun agreement. He is him, not them, under normal circumstances. And then there are things such as dangling verbals and misplaced modifiers and sentence fragments. let's talk for a minute about dangling verbals, and then we'll take our break. Let me erase this so that I can put a little bit of illustration on the board for you. Keep in mind that the things that we're talking about tonight and the grammar aspects of this class are not rules that are meant to make your life hard as a student or make your job hard as a writer. They're principles that are intended to help you express your thoughts so clearly, so simply, and so accurately that whoever reads what you write will understand exactly what you want them to understand. Well, as we talk about these things, in casual conversation, we oftentimes fall into the habit of speaking in a sloppy fashion because seeing each other, hearing each other's inflections, voices, being in the same room with each other, all of the visual cues that we can see help us understand what's being meant, even if the words are not grammatically in correct order. Let me give you an example. Let me write a sentence for you and tell me what's wrong with this. Tell yourself. Walking on the sidewalk the car ran over me. Exclamation point. Walking on the sidewalk, the car ran over me. Now, when you hear me say that statement, let me tilt this down a little bit so that maybe you can read it a little more clearly for a moment. Walking on the sidewalk, the car ran over me. When you hear that stated, you pretty well know what the speaker is trying to say. I was walking on the sidewalk and the car ran over me. But the dangling verbal phrase, walking on the sidewalk. See, here's a verb. Walking is a verb, a present tense active verb. Somebody, something is walking on the sidewalk. The car ran over me. Question. Have you ever seen a car walk? Cars don't walk. In English, when an introductory phrase, walking on the sidewalk, when an introductory phrase or a verbal phrase, participles, gerunds, infinitives, is out of place in the sentence, it makes a mockery of the sentence. An introductory phrase, a verbal phrase, walking on the sidewalk, is supposed to adhere to the subject of the main clause. Now, what's the subject of the main clause? Here's the main clause. The car ran over me. What's the subject of the main clause? The car. There's your subject. Ran over. There's your verb. Me. There's your direct object. But here we have a verbal phrase an introductory phrase, walking on the sidewalk, that applies not to the subject, but to the direct object. And yet the way it's structured, it doesn't make sense. It would lead you to believe that the car was walking on the sidewalk. When the subject of the main clause is not the doer of the action that's indicated in this verbal phrase. See, the car is the actor. I'm not the actor. I'm the object. When the subject of the main clause, the car, is not the doer of the action, the verbal phrase, this phrase is dangling. It's hanging out there, flapping in the wind, because it really doesn't make sense. It's not attached to the proper part of the sentence. It's not attached to me. I'm the one walking on the sidewalk, but it's attached to the subject incorrectly. To prevent this, let me stop and just make this point. The simplest way for most writers to find and fix these kinds of problems is to read out loud what you write. Don't read it silently. Read it out loud, or better yet, get someone else to read what you wrote out loud to you so that you can hear how it sounds. To prevent things like dangling verbals, make sure that the subject of the main clause is the doer of the action that's specified in the preceding verbal phrase. In other words, if you're going to start a sentence with walking on the sidewalk and end it with being run over by a car, you need to reverse the order of things in the main part of the sentence. So this should not say walking on the sidewalk, the car ran over me. It should say walking on the sidewalk, comma, I was run over by a car or the car. Walking on the sidewalk, I. Here's the subject now, and now the verbal phrase, the dangling verbal phrase, the introductory phrase, now it applies to me. Now it makes grammatical sense. Well, let's take a break. Okay, let's pick up again. I want to talk about misplaced modifiers for a moment, and then I want to come back from these grammatical things and make some principal points. Misplaced modifiers are some of the most common grammatical errors that you will find both in speech and in writing. Most of the time, we don't even notice them. Maybe a sentence sounds a little bit awkward, or something is slightly off about it, but we don't think about what it is that's actually wrong because we have enough information ordinarily to understand what the reader or writer or what the speaker means. Let me give you an example, though. Anyone Pardon my poor handwriting. I don't, writing with markers on boards doesn't come naturally to me. Anyone who reads a newspaper frequently will notice that many people are now concerned about pollution. Okay. That sounds like a simple enough sentence, doesn't it? Anyone who reads a newspaper frequently will notice that many people are now concerned about pollution. Here's the question for you. What does the word frequently modify? Frequently is sitting between two verbs that grammatically and semantically it could modify. Does frequently, does it modify reads? Or does it modify will notice? Are we talking about people who read newspapers frequently? Or are we talking about people who frequently notice something? How do you tell the difference? You tell the difference by moving the modifier. You put it where it belongs. If you want to modify reading, you might move frequently from in between reads and notice to right here. Anyone who frequently reads a newspaper will notice that many people are now concerned about pollution. No ambiguity there. Now we know for certain that frequently modifies reads. But what if we want to modify notice? Then we would move frequently from before will to after will. Anyone who reads a newspaper will frequently notice that many people are now concerned about pollution. Okay. Enough of that sort of stuff for this class. I want to talk to you for a moment about sentence structure. And then I want to talk to you a little more about clear writing. And then we'll call it class, maybe a few minutes early tonight. The sentence, more than anything else, the sentence is the basic unit of language. While I talk, I'm going to erase because I want to write a few things up here on the board. The sentence is the basic unit of language. A sentence can be a single word, or it can be a whole string of interconnected clauses and modifiers. Some of the longest, and some would say most complicated or convoluted sentences in all reading are found in the New Testament, specifically in the writings of the Apostle Paul. It's not unusual to find Paul beginning a sentence at verse 2 or verse 3 of a chapter and not coming to a period, full stop, for 10 or 12 verses. That's a long sentence, 100 words or more. A sentence can consist of a single word. It may run 100 words or more if the idea that it expresses is complex. And Paul's sometimes are. You know, the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 at about verse 16 says that some of the things that beloved Paul wrote about are hard to understand. Not impossible, but they're challenging. And so it's not easy to explain challenging things always in first grade words. Whatever the length of the sentence, if it's properly formed, it will give the hearer or the reader a sense of relative completeness, understanding as that sentence stands. We unconsciously put words into sentence patterns that, just like the words themselves, are characteristics of the language that we speak. Let me illustrate this in a very, very, very simple way and illustrate the fact that this changes from language to language. In a very simple English declaration, a young man says to his young lady friend, I, this is the subject, I love, this is the verb, you, this is the direct object of the verb. I love you. Simple, direct, to the point. And hopefully it doesn't get his face slapped because she loves him in return. Switch to another language, though, and you may or may not follow the same word order. This is English. How about German? I picked up a few words of German in high school many years ago. To express this very same thought, we would say ich liebe dich. And guess what? Because German and English are linguistically and grammatically related, the word order is basically the same. Although in German, the German speaker usually puts his verb at the end of the sentence. But he would say, ich liebe dich, I love you. Subject, verb, direct object. Oh, that makes it simple. We can translate. Same word order. Oh, but hold on. Let's go to Spanish. And now we say te amo. Te amo. But this doesn't say I love you in word order. If we translate it, if we put it word for word, as they say, into English, it says, You love I. Because in Spanish, the verb amor, amar, amor takes the verb ending amo to make it first person, present tense, active voice. I love, amo, te. But you don't say amo te in Spanish. In Spanish, the object, you, comes before the declaration. I love, or you love I. Now, I say all of that to emphasize that we, without even thinking about it, we put words into sentence patterns that we understand because they're part of our native language. We think in our native language, and we speak in our native language, and we express in our native language because it is our native language. But sentence patterns and thus thought patterns differ sometimes a lot from language to language. What I've just illustrated in this very simplistic way touches on the difficulty of accurate Bible translation from ancient Greek and Hebrew into modern English. Because we have folks that say, well, I want a word for word translation. You can't read a word for word translation and make sense of it. Because if you try to read a word for, if you try to produce a word for word translation, you wind up with a sentence that says, you love I, not I love you. Because the word order is different. In one language, the sentence structure, the sentence pattern of structure is different from one language to the next to the next. Sentence structure in English is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and pretty logical. Emphasis comes primarily from volume. The difference between a question and an exclamation depends on pitch. A question ends on an up pitch, whereas an exclamation may be all the same pitch, though highly pitched. Where are you going? Where are you going? Where are you going? Where are you going? How do you express that in print? Question mark tells you that what you're reading, should you read it aloud, should end on an up pitch. Where are you going? That's the audible cue in a visual form that this is a question. The exclamation point, likewise, is the visual form of that intensity and pitch that tells you that there's excitement behind that statement. Speech has a huge number of fragments and abbreviations Writing depends almost entirely on relatively complete utterances, relatively complete statements, complete sentences, complete questions. To express in writing what you express in speech requires much more precision because writing lacks the visual and the audible cues and clues that let us understand what we hear. Now, let's talk a little bit about writing so that you can be understood. If a reader can't understand what you write, if what you write does not create in the reader's mind the same image that's in your mind, who's dumb? The reader or the writer? That word dumb, according to Robert Gunning, is a boomerang. You know what a boomerang is? It's one of those wooden Australian flying things that when you throw it, you better duck when you do because it's coming back at you. In the slang sense of that word, if a reader can't understand what you write, the reader's dumb. But in the proper sense of that word, if the reader misunderstands, if the reader misunderstands what you write, it's not that the reader is dumb. The writer is. You have failed to communicate. In the classic film with Paul Newman, Cool Hand Luke, one of the prison, the warden of the prison, among others, the line is repeated in the movie. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Well, in point of fact, there was no failure of communication at all. The communication was actually quite clear. But if a reader misunderstands what you write, it's not the reader who is dumb. You have failed to communicate, and because you have failed to communicate, you have wasted your time and your energy and your ink and your nice clean paper, as well as the time and the energy of the person trying to read what you wrote. Good writing goes far beyond merely recording facts, merely recording information. Good writing goes beyond merely conveying information. To have effect, writing must communicate those facts to the reader. And the distance between the reader and the writer is a great, great gulf indeed. To understand what you write, the reader needs careful organization in what they're reading. Who's responsible for that? You are. They want concreteness to help them imagine and apply the ideas that you're trying to present. Readers like variety. It helps them stay interested. Readers prefer short sentences and not too many hard words. Writers, on the other hand, writers enjoy expressing themselves. Writers would rather use abstractions that they give their own special meanings than simply state something straight out. Many people set out to write and fail to write effectively because in writing they make the very same mistakes that irritate them in the writing of others. So, what do we do? Well, to write well, you have to train your mind to cut through surface details and get to the bones of your thought, get to the skeleton, get to the substance. Polish your English language constantly, but be careful how you polish it. You can make it so shiny and bright that it's blinding. You don't have to cover it with diamonds to the point that it glitters blindingly. Good writing is based on the right word in the right place. In order to have the right word at hand, you've got to know a lot of words. But don't use big words when little words will do. This is perhaps one of the most common sins of college writers and some preachers, to use big words when little ones will serve just as well. Clarity of style cannot replace clarity of thought. No matter how beautifully and clearly you can express yourself, if you're not clear in what you are trying to express, what you write will not be clear. Clear thinking leads to clear style. But to avoid foggy words, you have to work at it. The basic lesson you need to learn from this class as far as composition is concerned can be summarized in one word: simplicity. Simplicity. Generally speaking, a successful, effective writer is someone who has something to say and has learned how to say it simply. There's never been a writer who ever lived who gained a large readership by making his style more complex and more complicated and harder to follow and understand. Don't believe me? Sit down and read the dictionary and see how long it takes you to fall asleep. What do people read? Willingly. If a person's motive is strong enough, he'll plow through the most complex words. He'll go get a dictionary in order to understand what he's reading. It doesn't matter whether it's complex words or symbols or hieroglyphics. My 17-year-old grandson is not an especially willing reader. He's a competent reader, but he's not an especially willing reader. He is, however, a very eager and willing mechanic. And so he very willingly sits down with an engine manual and reads through page after page of technical jargon about the engine in his automobile so that he can understand it. The question to ask yourself as a writer is not, what can people read? People can read anything they want to. They can read the most complex, complicated material if they're forced to. But what do they want to read? They want to read simple material. It doesn't matter if a man has a 6th grade education or a PhD degree. In his reading, he wants the same thing. Something that's simple enough to understand easily. What do people read? 76 years ago, Frank Luther Mott for the Macmillan Publishing Company did a study, tabulated the best-selling books in America. The Bible has sold better in America than any other book. And at that time, the versions of the Bible available were the King James Version from 1769, the American Standard Version of 1901, and the Douay-Rheims Version, which is basically the Catholic equivalent of the King James Version that came out in 1609, I believe. The runners-up next to the Bible are a varied lot. At that time, people were reading Shakespeare's plays. That dates from the same time as the King James Version. Mother Goose, Ivanhoe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Ben-Hur, Gone with the Wind, and Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I think the list has probably changed a little bit in the intervening 75 or 80 years. Those books are spread over 3.5 centuries. Several of them are novels primarily meant for entertainment. One is aimed at reforming slavery. It's about social justice. Another is purely about self-improvement. When you talk about the authors, one was an actor, one was a nobleman, one was a housewife, one was a general, and another was a teacher. They range in style from the greatest English poetry in all of history to the conversational anecdotes of Dale Carnegie. But they all have one thing in common. Each one is written in relatively simple language for its time. Language that's less complex than you find on the front page of the average newspaper. Now, what about 2024? 2024, what are most people reading? Facebook, X, things like that. Social media. But as you read, you find that even though the sentences are fractured and filled with numerals and abbreviations, they're longer and more complex, muddier and less understandable than the Elizabethan statements of Shakespeare. Shakespeare was in the writing business. He was in business to be understood. And he did his job very well. Simplicity of language is one of the fundamental things necessary to make your reading accessible and to make your reader willing to read what you write. The second most widely sold novel in America, about 20 years ago, had a whole new life with a different title. By an 1890s writer named Charles Sheldon, it was originally called In His Steps, and it was a huge success. Between the 1890s and the 1990s, it was largely forgotten until it was republished as What Would Jesus Do? And then it caught flame and was a bestseller once again. The second most widely sold novel was Peyton Place. Those books are written on a 6th to 8th grade level. They're written to be understood by ordinary people. What do most people read? They read what they like. They read what interests them. And they read what does not make them struggle to understand what they're reading. People buy newspapers, even digitally, for the headlines, not for the body of the articles. They buy newspapers for the headlines, the comics, the sports page, and once upon a time for the ads. The headline, if it's good, tells you in one sentence or less everything you need to know in the article that follows. Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts in the comics page, mastered the art of expressing complex thoughts in first grade words. If reading material, what you write, goes above a certain level of complexity, readers aren't going to read it. Now, the greater experience and intelligence the reader has, the more likely he is to benefit from what you write. But if you make him reach for the dictionary every second sentence, it's not the dictionary he's going to put down only. It's also what you've written. Nearly any subject that can be discussed in prose, which is ordinary writing, that does not go beyond middle school level in complexity, can be understood. Simple sentences will serve for nearly any subject. Simple sentences and simple words are the keys to effective writing. Now, let me ask you a question. Why do the people read the comics? I realize that comics in the paper are declining, newspapers are declining, and so forth. But why did people read Calvin and Hobbes or Peanuts, Bloom County? Going farther back, Dick Tracy or Popeye or Pogo. If you're interested in reaching your audience, your reader, do not be above learning from the comics. Even if you think comics are dumb, moronic, a foolish waste of time. There are two reasons that the comics page is so readable and through history has been so widely read. In the first place, they're written in spoken language. Simple words. In the second place, comics present their information, their subject matter, in short takes, one idea at a time, one complete thought. Readers like periods and white space on the page. If you want to be an effective writer, you need to be a discerning reader. Readability, the quality of making what you write easy to read, easy to digest, easy to grasp, is a worthwhile goal. Writing is governed by a lot of principles, and we'll talk about some of them in this class. I'm talking tonight a lot about writing because research is of little value if the object, the information that's gleaned from that research cannot be, if you do not have the ability to relate that information in a clear, understandable way. I'm going to offer you a few little tidbits, principles that are helpful, and then we will wind this up a few minutes early. I'll give you a little time back tonight for this first class. What makes your writing readable? What gives it the quality that people are willing to read it? It is not really complicated. There are 10 principles that Robert Gunning discovered 100 years ago almost 100 years ago, about 90, that Gunning, I don't know that he discovered them, but he put them into print. And those principles, 7 of them, are the most helpful in terms of improving your writing. Number 1, let me erase this. Seven principles of clear writing. Number 1, sentence length, average sentence length in words. How many words is in your average sentence and when you write? Number 2 is the percentage of simple sentences. The percentage of simple sentences, how high is it? Number 3 is the percentage of strong verb forms. And we'll talk about verb forms as we go along. Number 4, these are principles, characteristics, qualities of clear writing. What is the portion or the percentage of familiar words? How many familiar words are there overall? Is it a high percentage, a small percentage? Number 5 is the contrast. What is the portion of abstract words? Which one's greater, which one's smaller when you write? Number 6 is the percentage of personal references. I, me, mine. Number 7, what's the percentage of long words? We're not talking about imaginary words like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious and Mary Poppins. Abraham Lincoln spoke at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, at the dedication of the cemetery there. He followed a congressman who had spoken for 2 hours and whose speech was lauded and praised in the newspapers of the day, whose editors largely did not like Lincoln. Lincoln's notes were written on the back of an envelope, and the Gettysburg Address, familiar to us for its beginning 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The entire address numbers 287 words and took less than 3 minutes. The editors of those papers who lauded their congressman's blowhard 2-hour oration mocked Lincoln's words. But history has had the last laugh. The congressman's name is forgotten in all but some dusty history books, and his speech, though it was recorded and printed, is memorized by no one. Lincoln's words have become immortal. Next week, in the next class, we will talk about sentence structure and the essentials of clear expression. So between now and then, do 2 things. Order the textbook, Style 10 Lessons in Clarity and Grace. Next week, we'll begin with the text. And write your assignment. Why I want to preach, or perhaps if you don't want to preach, why I do not want to preach. And I'll look forward to next week. Thank you for taking this class. Thank you for bearing patiently with me. I hope that I have not bored you out of your minds, and I hope that I have not frightened you off from the very idea of composition and research. I promise, if you'll stick with me, if you'll take these lessons to heart and learn them, they will improve your writing ability. They will improve your researching ability and your ability to understand and assimilate what you learn as you go. And they'll improve your grades as you go through the other courses in the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. Thank you for being here.